Russians or the Russian rebels. He came out almost immediately after the event, before the evidence was in. Now, he's demonstrated a habit of doing things before the evidence is in. His famous statement, you and I have discussed it about 10 times, drawing a red line in Syria, was something that he said before thinking out the consequences of his actions. And something came to light a few weeks ago on C-SPAN Book TV in an interview about with some people who've been doing some deep studies of Afghanistan. And the story goes like this. When Obama was running for president, he was going to visit Afghanistan, but he didn't want to meet Hamid Karzai first. He wanted to see American troops and have a photo opportunity with American troops first to show that he's all-American, red-blooded, and is supporting America's troops. All that is good, but he hadn't thought out the consequences of his actions. So as a consequence, his team, his staff, had to find him a military base in somewhere in Afghanistan that was sufficiently safe that he could fly in without having his tail shot off. They found something off in the hinterlands, and when Obama arrived, indeed, he got his press opportunity with the military guys, but he also had to do something else. For him, it must have been as automatic as greeting the mayor. There is a governor of that particular province, and the governor showed up, and he wanted his photo taken with Barack Obama, too. This guy is a warlord. All the governors, most of the governors in Afghanistan are probably warlords. Do you know what that warlord did with that picture? He gave the impression to the Afghan people that Obama had come to see him before seeing Hamid Karzai, and that this meant that the American government supported him more strongly than it supported Hamid Karzai. And that impression lasted for years. It was an unforeseen consequence, a consequence that Obama and his staff had not thought out, just as they had not thought out the consequences of drawing a red line on Syria. And just as I strongly suspect they have not thought out the consequences of jumping into the fray and saying that the Russians or Russian proxies did it before the evidence was in. Because there are three forces. Well, there are two forces we know with absolute certainty had Buk missiles in the Ukraine. The Russians, who had them on the Ukrainian border, which doesn't matter when you have a missile, and the Ukrainians, the people we support, the folks in Kiev. And then there's a third party. 3 hours ago, the New York Times came out with a story. They had interviewed an official with one of the military battalions, the pro-Russian military battalions. And that official, there are many military battalions who are allied with the Russians in the eastern Ukraine, not just the People's Republic of Donetsk. So when the People's Republic of Donetsk says, we didn't do it, we don't even have Buk missiles, that's a false statement because there are other battalions that may. And in fact, this battalion, pro-Russian battalion commander today, said, yes, there were Buk missiles. They were in the hands of the Luhansk brigades. So if that turns out to be accurate, we don't know who shot this missile. The odds are 80% that it came from the Russians. But meanwhile, I have a collaborator in theoretical physics at the Keldysh Institute of Applied Mathematics of the Russian Academy of Sciences in Moscow. And he gave me the Moscow perception of things today. Now, which is, everybody knows this was done by the Ukrainians in order to blame the Russians. Everybody knows that the real goons, the real terrorists, the people who don't care about human life, are the folks in Kiev, who everybody in Russia knows are Nazis and neo-Nazis. And there was something, you and I talked about this once. Pavel, my collaborator, Pavel Karakin, when there were riots going on and when the pro-Russian forces were first seizing buildings, there was a building burned down, a government building with 40 people inside, and those people were all killed. And we blamed it on the pro-Russian forces, but the pro-Russian forces blamed it on us. They said we did it and wouldn't let them into the building to save the people inside. And the photos of those burned bodies, which are as horrible a sight as you can possibly imagine, because you can imagine yourself being every single one of those people and burning to death, have been circulated all over Russia. But they've been circulated with the message that this is the kind of terrorism that those neo-Nazis in Kiev, that America, which is apparently a neo-Nazi government itself, has been supporting. In fact, there was a headline in Pravda RU that said that the Kievans, the Ukrainians we support, that the United States support, are pursuing a scorched earth policy, which is precisely the policy dictated to them by their master, the United States. So the perception in Russia is the mirror opposite of our perception, the very mirror opposite. And it pays to understand the perception of other people. It makes you see how easily your perception could be changed, and it's your obligation to look for the facts.
You know, I've always said, Howard, there's three sides to every story: his side, her side, and the truth.
No. Well, in this case, that's very much the case, and we shouldn't jump to conclusions. And our press has become sufficiently lazy to jump to conclusions and not investigate.
But the press is looking for the sensationalistic headlines. Now, please don't get me wrong. You know, the loss of any life in my book is a very sad mark on humanity. But taking
no life should be lost by human violence.
Exactly, my friend. But when we're looking at what is going on in the Ukraine, are we watching a political chess game unfold between the United States and Russia?
Exactly, because if you look at the Russian side of the story and the far left side of the story in the United States, and we've talked about this before, America has spent $6 billion trying to pry these nations on Russia's very border away from Russia and make them part of the European Union. $6 billion. And Victoria Tennant, the woman who said, am I allowed to say this on the radio, who basically said, let's tame it down, screw the European Union, on the phone, and it was blasted all over the place. Victoria Tennant, according to the far left and according to the Russians, was the bag lady for the $6 billion that was spent to do the equivalent of taking Canada and Mexico and turning them against the United States. We would not tolerate that in the United States. We would never tolerate it. So, yes, there is a chess game going on here, but there's one positive thing, Rob. I hate to hit you with any positives. The numbers of people who were killed in face-offs of this kind in the days of World War I and World War II were up to 200,000 a day. 200,000 people were killed a day in a single battle. When America felt that its existence was threatened, the way that Israel feels its very existence is threatened now that 2,000 rockets have been rained upon it in 2 weeks, when America and not a single weapon had touched the United States, we killed 650,000 women, babies, children, civilians in Europe and in Japan in order to keep ourselves intact. It was called World War II. We drove 12.5 million people out of their homes in order to ensure our survival. That was called World War II. That's what we did, the Americans. There were additional civilian deaths because of what the British did. And, we had to bomb France to get that back. At any rate, the percentage of violence in the conflict, the chess game that we see going on right now in Israel, in Palestine, whatever you want to call it, in Gaza, and in the Ukraine, the number of people killed is the tiniest number by comparison with those vast numbers in the half millions that we saw during World War II. This is covered in 2 pages of my book, The Lucifer Principle, the extent to which we are far more peaceful today. As hard as it is for us to believe, we are far more peaceful today than we were in the days of our famous indigenous tribal ancestors who we are told lived in peace and in harmony with nature. No, they did not. We have 10 times as much peace today as they had. In other words, your odds of dying a violent death at the hand of another human being are 1/10 what they were in the days of indigenous tribes and 1/10 what they were in 1650. So the percentage of violence has gone down dramatically. The most important thing to keep your eyes peeled in these two situations is to make sure they do not become flashpoints for World War III.
Well,
and then it's important. That's why it's important to keep your eye on the South China Sea at all times, because that's where another flashpoint is developing. And never let that get out of your sight. Don't just be distracted by the headlines from the Ukraine and Gaza.
You know, I've always known that you never push somebody into a corner, because as soon as you get them into a corner, their natural instinct is to come out swinging. And when I look at what's happening, I see country after country after country after country joining this group that is pushing Russia into a corner.
We're pushing Russia into a corner. Israel's being pushed into a corner by Hamas. Hamas has been pushed into a corner because the Arab nations will not let any of those Palestinian refugees out of these squalid camps they live in, which are actually now cities, but out of these very, very contained camps, and they will not let them into the vast hinterlands of the Arab world. There's so much undeveloped territory in the Arab world. The Arab world is twice the size of the United States. Israel is the size of New Jersey. The amount of empty land that could be turned into gardens and paradises in the Islamic world is huge. Settling the Palestinian people would take almost no effort whatsoever. The Arabs have kept them in these squalid refugee camps ever since 1948 for a reason. To be able to unite their own people who, as you can see, when a dictator falls, like Saddam Hussein in Iraq, you can see the countries fall apart. Libya has fallen apart since the days of Muammar Gaddafi. They needed any tool. The Arab nations and the Islamic nations have needed any tool they could get to unite their people, and having an enemy that they could continually portray as a monster, Israel, was extremely useful to them over the last 60 years. But it's time to let those people out of these prisons. It's time to let the people of Gaza out of this tiny little territory and let them into some of this vast Arab land. Let the Israelis show them, I'll show them, how to turn it into gardens and into the kinds of lush farmlands that the Israelis have turned their deserts and their malarial swamps into.
Let me ask you a question, Howard. With the president's, how should we call it here? His ratings, how he's liked by the people, it's at an all-time low, 42%. Instead of concentrating on the problems in the Ukraine, the problems in the Middle East, he's out raising money.
He needs to do that.
I understand.
We've cornered him into that position in the United States, especially since the days of the Citizens United decision in the Supreme Court. If you were about to go into politics and I was a shrewd political advisor, I would have one word of advice for you. You have to realize that 50 to 60% of every single day you are in politics has to be spent raising money. It doesn't matter whether you're a senator, a congressman, a president, an assemblyman, 60% of your day has to be spent raising money. 5 hours of every 8-hour day. Of course, in politics, you work 17-hour days. Has to be spent raising money. Well, what time does that give you to concentrate on legislation? A lot of people in the United States are being driven into corners. You know that the day that Obama won the election, Mitch McConnell went out in front of the public and he said, basically, our job from now on is not going to be to govern this country. It's going to be, and he's talking about the Congress and the Senate, it's going to be to make sure that Obama is a one-term president. Well, he didn't succeed in that. He did.
With each new extreme weather event or terrorist act, it becomes increasingly obvious that we live in uncertain and challenging times. We all buy car insurance. Why not collapse and catastrophe insurance? Matthew Stein, an MIT-trained engineer and green builder, has written 2 outstanding books to help people prepare, plan for, and deal with everything from minor situations lasting a few days to full-on collapse. Matt's first book, When Technology Fails, is a manual for self-reliance, sustainable living, and surviving the long emergency. This massive book covers the gamut from first aid and emergency preparedness to alternative healing, renewable energy, primitive living skills, and 18th century technologies that could be critical to your comfort and survival in a long-lasting crisis. Matt's second book, When Disaster Strikes, is a comprehensive emergency preparedness handbook and survival guide. When Disaster Strikes is an essential item for every family's go bag. Both books are available at all usual sources. There's a wealth of totally free information posted at whentechfails.com, and author-signed copies may be purchased at mattstein.com. That's www.whentechfails.com and www.mattstein.com. MATSTEIN.com.